This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online hemophilia community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info, like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos, the best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar, and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as we put the live in living with hemophilia. You can even like us on Facebook. That's even better because you can use emojis on our Facebook page and receive all our latest updates. So check out Living with Hemophilia. And before you wish happy birthday to that friend from 3rd grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to another episode of Ask the Expert. I am Amy Board, your host, and today we're going to talk about another insurance issue, an out-of-pocket cost issue, and a policy issue. There's some solutions that are being presented federally in Washington, D.C., and we're going to talk about it today. My guests today are from the Hemophilia Federation of America, or HFA, as we all know. Today, Miriam Goldstein is the policy director at HFA. She's going to be joining us, as well as their advocacy director and community member, Sonji Wilkes. Miriam is going to break it down for us, this issue of surprise billing. Surprise billing is basically exactly how it sounds. It's a surprise bill. But the thing that is scary, the thing that is unfortunate, is a lot of times with this issue, you do your homework. You do your homework for a planned procedure. For example, you have a knee replacement surgery and you do your homework. You check if the facility is in network. You check that the surgeon is in network, all of those things, and make your plans accordingly. And after the procedure is done, you get a whopping bill for someone, a part of your healthcare team, like an anesthesiologist or something like that, that is not in network. And you had no idea, and it's a big whopper, and it's a huge issue that has been a problem for a long, long time. So today we're going to discuss the ins and outs of that issue. Sonja, personally, is going to share her story. She has a very compelling story of when her son was born 16 years ago, actually. So it has been around that long, and both of them are going to give options and recommendations of what to do if that happens to you and your family. So we're so excited to have both of them with us today. Before we get into it, let's do the thing. Let's do the housekeeping things. Have to give a plug to our flagship podcast, Bloodstream. Patrick and Natalie do a great recap of the Bleeding Disorder Conference in Anaheim that happened here at the beginning of October. So if you were unable to join us at that conference, you'll get a great recap through our segments through Bloodstream. So make sure to check that out. I have to give my plea, as always, that I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear your questions and your thoughts for future podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at Bordo87. And of course, you can always email me at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. And I have to tout Bloodstream Media for a little bit. We just found out this week that Ask the Expert and Bloodstream was in the top 10 hematology podcasts that came out of a FeedSpot poll as the 10 podcast in hematology that you must listen to. We are so proud of the work that we do here at Believe Limited, and in particular Bloodstream Media, and we're psyched that we were on that list. That's really great. We hope we add value to you and your families as you guys navigate hemophilia, von Willebrand's disease, and other rare bleeding disorders. So we're excited about that, and I just want to thank our team here at Believe Limited for making these podcasts happen. Pretty cool. And as always, I want to give a special thanks to Bayer Pharmaceuticals for sponsoring Ask the Expert. Without the support of companies like Bayer, this stuff wouldn't get made, and these conversations like the one I'm going to have today wouldn't happen. So we are so grateful. So let's get into it. Let's talk about this insurance stuff. Buckle up. This is going to be great. Again, with this insurance stuff, we're going to talk about the ins and outs of the issue, but in classic bleeding disorder form, we are going to also have a story of what it looks like in real time with real families. So you'll get kind of an idea of how it affects bleeding disorder families. So we really hope that this will be valuable for you. So grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's have ourselves a conversation. I am your host, Amy Board, and welcome to episode 32, or our Surprise Billing 101 episode of the Ask the Expert podcast. My guests today are Miriam Goldstein and Sonji Wilkes. Both are on staff at the Hemophilia Federation of America, or HFA, as we all know in the bleeding disorder community. Today's topic is policy and advocacy related. We are going to discuss surprise billing. We're going to discuss what the issue is about, how to recognize it if it happens to you, and HFA's work within it. I'm so excited to have you both. Miriam, we haven't met personally before, so I just want to thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy.
And of course, Sonja and I are both from Colorado, and we have known each other for years. So personally, this is very fun for me. So Sonja, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. It's good to be with you today.
So Miriam, tell me a little bit about the mission of HFA and the organization's work in the policy world advocating for bleeding disorders. What does HFA focus on in terms of policy and advocacy?
Well, HFA is 25 years old. We just had our anniversary at our last symposium. And since the inception of HFA, advocacy has been at the heart and at the core of everything we do. It is a big part of Sonja's and my work because we work on the policy and advocacy team, but even throughout our programs, throughout our publications, throughout everything we do, advocacy is at the core. When I think about the policy issues that most animate our work, I have always put them in kind of three buckets. I think about what people with bleeding disorders need from the healthcare system. And the first and most obvious thing is we need access to care and to our treatments. We need access to clotting factor or whatever medications we use to control and prevent bleeding. So the second bucket, obviously, is some kind of health coverage to pay for the care and treatment, because those are very expensive, and no one except, Bill Gates could probably afford to cope with a bleeding disorder without some kind of health insurance, either public or private. And then the third bucket is a protection from the financial costs of living with a bleeding disorder, even with good coverage. Sometimes you can read about people who are dealing with the impact of a cancer diagnosis, the financial burdens that places, and those are severe, but we face those expenses every single year in and year out. So in terms of coverage and priorities, those are the three buckets. I will add that blood safety has also been a policy priority very near and dear to HFA's heart, and really that it has expanded beyond blood safety to encompass product safety, particularly as we are embarking on an era of new and novel treatments. So we want to be very connected with the regulators and be a voice insisting on patient safety and safeguarding patients in an era of new treatments. Also ensuring access to those new treatments. So I kind of gave you three buckets and then I gave you two more.
That's wonderful. What a great overview, and what a fantastic reminder to those in the community that might feel alone and isolated in some of these very real, very day-to-day insurance and affordability issues that we have national organizations that are working on this every day. So I think that's such a wonderful reminder that it's not for naught. I think that's wonderful. Sonja, just to throw it over to you quick, welcome to the podcast. I was trying to think when I was putting this together how long I've known you and your family, and I think it's well over a decade.
Probably, yeah. I was going to say Thomas is 16, so somewhere between 10 and 16 years.
That's crazy. So tell us a little bit about your work personally at HFA and in the community.
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, my son Thomas is 16 years old, so that's when I first came into the community. But I've been either volunteering or working in the community that entire 16 years, and joined HFA about 6 years ago. And my roles have changed over the course of those 6 years, but I'm currently the Director of Advocacy at HFA. And a lot of what I do day to day is really developing education and communication resources for community members with that patient voice in mind. So Miriam and I work really closely together. She is the policy expert and she explains it to me. And then we work together as a team to try to put some of these really complicated issues into language that folks can understand.
So great. I am so thrilled to have you both on. I think this is going to provide a comprehensive view of this issue in particular. We're going to talk about surprise billing today, and it's one of those classic insurance out-of-pocket issues where, folks can't fathom that it's even a thing. And if it happens to you, it becomes this massive problem and stress and financial burden for a while. And so to begin, Miriam, I'd like to throw it to you. What is surprise billing? How did it come about? What does it look like to a family? Tell us a little bit about what it is.
Sure. It's been around for a long time. Let me start with that. It's very much in the news right now because of welcome legislative efforts to try and address it, but it is not a new problem. And Sonja, when she tells you about her story, will testify to that. To explain what surprise billing is, it's helpful to go back and do a little Insurance 101. And specifically to talk about insurance networks. So one way that insurance companies try to keep healthcare costs down for everyone is by establishing networks of providers. Those can be doctors, they can be hospitals, all different kinds of healthcare providers in the healthcare system. A healthcare provider that enters into a contract with an insurance company basically is agreeing to accept a set reimbursement rate and to kind of cut the insurance company a good deal on the rate that the provider will charge. And what the provider gets in return is they're in network, and so they're likely to get a lot more traffic, a lot more customers who have that insurance policy. The insurance company directs its beneficiaries to go to in-network providers. So let's make up a simple example. Let's say you as a patient are going to an in-network healthcare provider. And, if you look at your explanation of benefits, you'll see the quoted rate for that visit might be $1,000. Holy moly. And yet you then see that the in-network rate is $300. The provider has agreed to give the insurance company a substantial discount off of that quoted rate and accept $300 in reimbursement. And then maybe your share of that, your copay is $30. So, okay, that all seems manageable. That settles the bill. Once you pay your copay, you're done. If you see an out-of-network healthcare provider instead, that's a healthcare provider who hasn't reached this kind of agreement with an insurance company to accept a lower level of reimbursement. So you've got the same $1,000 bill, that undiscounted rate for services. And the insurer says, you know what, out-of-network provider, I don't have an agreement with you. You're out of network, so I'm going to pay you $250. That's often the case, that the insurance company pays less to out-of-network providers than in-network providers. The problem is, because there is no agreement between the healthcare provider and the insurance company, they can now come after you, the patient, for the entire balance of above what the insurance company paid and that $1,000. So you could be on the hook for $750. That's why surprise billing is sometimes called balance billing. There are a number of situations where people are most likely to encounter this kind of surprise or balance billing. One of them is an emergency room situation. You're in emergency, maybe you are unconscious, and so you're not able to ask these sophisticated inquiries about, hey, are you taking me to an emergency room that's in my network? Or it's such a dire emergency, you can't ask even if you're conscious. So emergency rooms are one situation where people needing emergency care might end up at an out-of-network provider. Ambulances and air ambulances are another case where, again, you're not in a position to ask questions and negotiate and look for a better deal. But another category is where you might do your homework. You go to an in-network facility. You go for your knee replacement to an in-network hospital. But unbeknownst to you, even though you've done your homework, it turns out that one or more providers involved in your care are out of network. The hospital may have contracted with out-of-network anesthesiologists or radiologists or pathologists. Those are some of the specialties that tend or where you see the out-of-network problem most often. And so that becomes a very nasty surprise as well as a balance billing situation. You've done your homework, you're expecting to just pay the in-network rates, and all of a sudden someone involved in your care is billing you a whopping bill.
And I think that's important to reiterate that this happens even if you do your homework. And for the bleeding disorder community, who 9 times out of 10 is so engaged in their healthcare and of course their spend, their healthcare costs, this can happen to you even if you've done your planning, because one member of the team is out of network, which just blows my mind that that's a thing. That's not a question. I guess it's just a statement. It just blows my mind. What is the incentive for providers to be out of network, Miriam?
That's a complicated question. So it turns out, like emergency room physician groups are a group that are often out of network. And it turns out that some of those physician groups have actually been brought up by private venture capital interests. And so they just think they have more leverage to get higher reimbursement if they're out of network. Really discouraging.
You mentioned a little bit about the procedures that this would affect, and I just wonder if we could go through some scenarios. So you mentioned like a knee replacement, an emergency situation. Can we talk a little bit about, will this happen if you go to, let's say, your HTC, for example?
So I want to distinguish between the emergency situation and the knee replacement. So the emergency situation by itself is a situation where you can unwittingly end up at an out-of-network facility. And the knee replacement I was offering as an example more of one of those situations where you've done your homework, you think you've got in-network providers, but one or more of the sub-pieces ends up being contracted out to an out-of-network provider. With HTCs, we strongly, right now we are in the middle or not in the middle, approaching open enrollment for 2020 plan years. And one of the things we strongly encourage people with bleeding disorders to do as they evaluate their insurance options for the coming year is, among many other things, make sure your HTC is in network if you get your care at an HTC. My own family had changed insurance at one point when my sons were younger because our HTC was going to be out of network with our long-standing insurance plan. And keeping access to the HTC and keeping the HTC in network was that important for our family. HTCs in general, I think, try to do a good job of keeping all HTC providers in the same network. So we have not heard of concerns from our community about, I went to my HTC and I got a surprise bill from one set of providers. I think our HTCs are sensitive to the needs of our community, so that problem of thinking you're in network and getting a surprise bill, I haven't heard from people in the HTC context.
I think it's actually a good example just because we're so familiar with HTCs and what it feels like that you could search on, when you are choosing your insurance plan for the facility. So for the HTC in particular at the university or, the standalone facility, but each provider in that system, so each hematologist, each doctor could be, and I guess, Miriam, I'm asking you, each provider could have separate contracts with different insurance agencies. So if you go into the HTC, one doctor, Dr. Smith, would be in network and Dr. Bill would not. Is that what this is about?
I think it's theoretically possible, but it is not something I have to say that I have heard people encountering.
Okay.
If I can interject, I think it could potentially be a problem, say if as a bleeding disorders patient, you were inpatient at a hospital, in a hospital system that houses your HTC, say, and say it's not necessarily the hemophilia hematologist, right? The one that you typically see when you're in clinic, but it's over the weekend and you get one of the hematology oncologists as you're attending that weekend. I think potentially maybe there you could see a surprise billing, but I haven't, like Miriam, I haven't heard of any issues to that effect.
I agree. I think that's a great example, Sonja.
That's great. What type of insurance does this issue affect? For example, if you're on Medicaid, does this happen to your family?
It should not happen on Medicaid because that is a public plan, and and balance billing is also not currently permitted under Medicare. So it mainly happens to people with private insurance, but it can happen to people with all kinds of private insurance, either employer-sponsored insurance or individual plans that they've purchased on the marketplace. And that difference is why, as a policy matter, we need a federal fix. There are about 28 states that have passed varying degrees of surprise billing protection, which is great, and we enthusiastically support member orgs who are pursuing state legislation. But state legislation doesn't protect people who get their insurance from a self-funded employer plan. And that's why you need a federal fix and a state fix both.
Is this one of those issues or just, a tier in our healthcare system that affects premiums at all? Like if this, is this a thing to help keep premiums down? How does it affect premiums?
You'll definitely hear arguments from interest groups who've been lobbying on this issue that it does. And you'll hear both sides arguing for that. As I said, right now there are a number of federal bills. I think there are about half a dozen different federal bills, two main ones, addressing surprise billing, and lobbying about those bills really ramped up over the summer. If you listen to people across the spectrum talking about surprise billing, they all pay at least lip service to the idea of we want to protect patients and keep them out of the middle. And the disagreement arises over how to adjudicate that underlying claim as between the insurance company and the healthcare provider. And it boils down to, do you set benchmark rates, so you just set rates that out-of-network providers have to accept, or do you send the claims to arbitration? We, HFA and a number of other patient groups, are saying we're not going to weigh in on that question of benchmark versus arbitration. We just want to protect patients. We are patient groups, and that is our sole focus. But the people arguing over that, how do you adjudicate the underlying claim, say that that has implications for premiums and the growth of healthcare costs in general. That you need to set, one side would say you need to set benchmark prices to keep overall costs low and prevent that ripple effect on premiums. And other side saying, well, you'll limit access and if you don't allow for arbitration.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join the exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the ol' internet. I think you'll love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and, most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community, brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on the Living with Hemophilia Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. I mean, unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
This is a great foundational understanding of what the issue actually is. There is a bill at the federal level that's aimed at finding a solution, or at least a partial solution to this issue. So Miriam, tell us a little bit about what is in the bill and aspects of the bill that we should be aware of.
So there are 6 bills pending in Congress right now, 3 in the House and 3 in the Senate, but there are really 2 main ones, one on each side, one in the House and one in the Senate. And they both passed their respective committees, not the full bodies, with bipartisan support last summer. So both of them are comprehensive. They would limit the patient costs. They would hold patients harmless and limit the patient costs to that in-network copay or whatever the in-network cost-sharing rate is. And they would do that both in the emergency situation and in the you unwittingly got out-of-network care at an in-network facility setting. They differ again with respect to how do you settle that underlying claim between the insurer and the healthcare provider. So do you set a benchmark, or do you leave arbitration as an option for if the insurer and health care provider can't agree on a benchmark rate? The Senate bill also includes air ambulance coverage, but we were very excited when there was so much momentum behind these bills in the summer, and Sonji testified on the House side, which I know she's going to tell you about. But I have to say, during the summer recess, while Congress was out of town, the lobbying really stepped up. You may have seen advertisements. I was seeing ads online, on TV, in the paper, from, generally speaking, insurers on one side and hospitals and doctor associations on the other, about these bills. And because of the heavy lobbying and because there's a lot of other crazy stuff happening in Washington right now, progress is kind of stalled on the bills.
We'll get to that later as well, just in terms of the politics and just what it's like down there, because I think that is an important an important fact to kind of cover. But in terms of partnerships and allies, who are you guys partnering with in support of this issue? And you mentioned some groups that are opposing, but what are the industries that are opposing it? And what is the argument on both sides, if you will?
So there are at least two major patient-allied coalitions that are advocating for passage of a surprise billing fix. We are in one group. It's a large coalition of pretty much every patient advocacy org you've ever heard of that is very much taking the position, fix this, fix it in all settings, not just the emergency room, but also that all settings where you might receive out-of-network care. Take patients out of the middle, fix ambulances, and by the way, notice and transparency is not enough. It's not enough for someone who's at the hospital to say, oh, by the way, the anesthesiology department is out of network, because at that point, you don't really have real options to go elsewhere. So there's one very large group of patient organizations. The American Cancer Society is really spearheading that effort. There's another group that includes patient organizations, but also includes labor unions and the insurance industry. And it is also saying take patients out of the middle, but they are saying we definitely want a benchmark rate solution. So they're addressing that underlying piece about setting rates or determining the respective claims of insurers and healthcare providers. And they're explicitly saying, we think this will keep costs down for the whole system if you set benchmark rates instead of allowing an arbitration solution. On the other side, kind of working against these bills or saying they're for them, but you need to have arbitration and you need to have this, that, and the other exception, are some healthcare provider groups, air ambulance groups, and hospital groups, and it turns out some, as I said, venture capital-backed interests, which is a weird place to be. And they are saying, you must go to arbitration, otherwise it hurts providers, it could hurt rural hospitals, and it's not fair to providers.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like the two solutions that are being knocked around is the transparency issue. So having a notice go out to consumers that what will the notices do? And then the other solution that you mentioned is the underlying issue. So actually dealing with rates, pay rates or benchmark rates, which will be given to the providers. So will you explain those two things for us? I'm even having trouble.
So the question of notice is it enough when someone presents at a hospital, they've done their research, they've come to the hospital, and it's in network, is it enough to give them a document when they're in there saying, hey, by the way, our pathology lab is not in network, or our anesthesiology department is not in your network? And patient groups with one voice have said that's not enough. If you're going to give notice for, say, for an elective procedure, it has to be ahead of time and it has to be very clear. It has to be at a point where a person has a real choice, has an ability to make a choice. And in any event, notice is not enough. There have to be substantive protections for the patient against the balance billing or the surprise billing. It should not be permissible for an in-network facility to contract with out-of-network providers who then balance bill patients who come to the in-network facility. So that's the notice issue. Maybe I should stop there.
That Thank you for that. That is very clear. And then explain a little bit about the rates. And I know this might get policy wonky a little bit, but just to explain for listeners how that would affect a solution at the underlying issue.
Yeah, and again, HFA and a lot of the other patient orgs are not taking a position on this issue. I will just say that at the outset. So the question, let's go back to that $1,000 bill that we were talking about. Let's say it's for ER care, even though I can't imagine you could sneeze in an ER for $1,000. I mean, seriously, right? Let's say everyone agrees, you know what, we're going to hold the patient harmless. The patient copay is only going to be $50 for that ER visit. But the out-of-network provider says, you know what, my charge was $1,000. And the insurance company says, but our in-network reimbursement is $300. So the question is, what happens to that bill? How much does the ER get paid for that visit when these two opposing positions are staked out? The people saying you need a benchmark say, you know what, set a price that applies to all providers in that area. And, you know, maybe you set it at 125% of the Medicare rate or something. Just set a set fee. So that level of ER visit gets paid at $400 and that's it. The idea of arbitration is, we don't like price setting for philosophical reasons. So we'll allow both parties, the patient is out of it, the patient is fine, the patient has only paid the set copay of $30 or whatever it was, but the hospital or the ER and the insurance company are going to go to arbitration and each of them will put in their bid. And they talk about baseball-style arbitration, which I am not a sports person, but I think it means you each put in your bid and the arbitrator is going to pick one of them and you're going to be bound by it. So you have an incentive to be reasonable. You're not, you know, the insurer isn't going to put in a $10 bid because they're likely to lose and be kicked to the higher end of what the ER has proposed. So maybe the ER would propose $500 and the insurer would propose $400 and the arbitrator would pick one of those. That seems more involved, and the labor unions, health insurers fear that it will lead to higher reimbursements and therefore higher costs for the system and therefore higher premiums.
That is clear, and that helps give us a better understanding of how folks are thinking about finding a solution. Kind of at the heart of the politics of it, you know, you said there's 6 bills, but there are 2 that are you guys are looking at. Why are there 2 bills in the separate houses aimed at the same thing? Tell us a little bit about that process.
Well, to become a law, you need both a House and a Senate bill, and different groups of lawmakers in each body were developing their own proposals. So one version came out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and a different version was developed by members of the Senate Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee. To become law, they would have to pass both houses, and because they would be different, they would go to a conference committee and to be harmonized and then have to pass both houses again. So that would be the route forward. There is some concern that so much attention is elsewhere right now in Washington that maybe a more realistic way for a surprise billing fix to be passed would be for it to be wrapped into a bigger bill, like a funding bill. A lot of the government agencies have not yet had their budgets approved for 2020. And so, but the same process would have to happen. There would be a House version, there would be a Senate version, there would be a conference committee where the differences are hashed out and resolved one way or the other, and then it would have to pass both houses.
Thank you, Miriam, for explaining all of this complicated stuff so well. I really appreciate it. Sonja, I'd love to turn it to you to share your story with this issue and how it affects real families in real time. I hope you would retell a little bit of what happened to you and you guys, and give us an idea of how it looks in the real world.
Yeah. So as Miriam mentioned earlier, surprise billing is definitely not a new issue, and it actually happened to us right out of the gate. Just pretty much as soon as we first learned how to spell hemophilia. Thomas was born. We had no family history, and we, like most parents that are expecting, had checked our insurance plan, saw that the hospital that we wanted to deliver in was in network. Our OBGYN was in network, and so we thought everything was A-okay. And so Thomas was born, typical normal delivery, and then after his circumcision was continued to bleed. And we were lucky in that our pediatrician ran the right test right away, but nonetheless, we got that diagnosis of severe hemophilia, and they transferred Thomas to the neonatal intensive care unit. The hospital we were at didn't even stock clotting factor. So since the pediatrician didn't really know much about hemophilia, he had called the University of Colorado Hemophilia Treatment Center, and Dr. Mako Johnson actually came over with clotting factor and taught us about hemophilia. But not only did she teach us, my husband and I, but she taught the entire neonatal intensive care unit staff. She started the IV, she mixed the clotting factor, she pushed the clotting factor. And it's important to note that she wasn't on staff at that particular hospital. She just came over out of the goodness of her heart and took care of a bleeding child. And so we didn't really think much of that, of billing, because we were at an in-network hospital. So we didn't worry about it until a couple of months later when we got a bill for $50,000. And we were astonished, stunned, scared, pick an adjective, but definitely unexpected. You're in the middle of dealing with this brand new diagnosis. Your child has a chronic lifelong disorder, and now you're hit with a bill for $50,000. And the reasoning on the statement said out-of-network provider. And so we started researching it, and what we learned was that the neonatal intensive care unit in the hospital that we had given birth, 50 yards from the exact room that I had given birth in, was out of network. The hospital system had contracted out the services of the NICU to a third-party provider who was not in our network. And so what do? When you're told your baby is bleeding and that he has a life-threatening condition, your first question isn't, well, is that in network? No, your first response is take care of my baby, do whatever you need to do. And so Nathan and I fought it. We fought the bill, and we lost. The hospital was pretty insistent that we were going to have to pay that bill. And those folks that know Nathan and I know that we're pretty stubborn. And so we didn't pay the bill, and ultimately our credit was ruined. We just refused to pay it because we had made a good faith effort, checked our coverage, went to a facility that we thought was in network, and found out the hard way that the services that we needed in an emergent situation were not in network.
Oh, Sonja, that is unreal. And it happened so long ago. I think Oh my goodness, it happened so long ago. You had the opportunity to tell the story and to testify in support of this in DC. I can imagine it was very compelling, but what was that like?
Hectic is one way to describe it. So DC moves pretty fast. It's kind of like Ferris Bueller. Don't blink or you'll miss it. But Families USA is an organization that does a lot of healthcare advocacy work. And Nathan and I, my husband and I, had done some work with them back when the Affordable Care Act was being passed. And Families USA was familiar with our family story. And so when they got word that the health subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee was going to be having a hearing about surprise billing, Families USA reached out to our family and asked if we would be willing to share this story. It so happened that I was going to be in DC during that time, and so they just asked if I would be willing to share that story. I think that was on a Thursday, and I testified the following Tuesday. So just a few days notice. You, as a witness for Congress, you have to submit written testimony ahead of time. So I quickly wrote up the testimony. Miriam and my other colleague, Kim Eisenberg, were just spectacular in helping me edit that. And then you just practice. It's kind of like that public speaking before a college class or a high school class. Read my testimony over and over again to get familiar with it. And then, I don't know, you show up and you sit down and shake in your boots a little bit and just kind of get through it. I think the thing I was most afraid of were the questions from the representatives, because I just didn't know what they were going to ask. But I was somewhat lucky, I guess, in that I was the good guy at the table. All of the other folks that were witnesses for that particular hearing were from the industry side. They were doctors, or they were the heads of, say, the air ambulance, and they were the ones really on the hot seat. I was there to provide the real life example.
Miriam mentioned that you testified on the House side. What committee was it?
So it was a subcommittee. It was the health subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
Do you remember their faces? Do you remember, were they moved by your story? What was that like? Did you make personal eye contact, or were you just trying to get through it?
No, good question. No, I definitely tried to make personal eye contact. I mean, the good thing is you can read, you can read your statement. So I definitely stuck to my script. So I didn't go off script, because you have a time limit. I only had 5 minutes. And I looked up as much as I could, but I think the best way to say it is that I felt supported. In a very bipartisan world, this didn't feel bipartisan. I felt support from both sides of the aisle. Several of the representatives referred back to my story as they made their own statements or during the questioning. I mean, this was a 4.5-hour hearing. So it wasn't just sit there and say my piece and then leave. It was quite a lengthy hearing.
So this next question is for both of you. What is your recommendation to our community if this happens to them? Where do you think they should go? Who can assist in the fight per se? Who is the fight with? What would you recommend?
Well, I'll start. I mean, first I'll put a plug in for HFA, and I would say if anyone is having any sort of insurance burden, challenge, barrier, we want to hear from people. We have a project called Project Calls where we collect those stories and we take those stories back to lawmakers to say, these are the issues that are affecting our community and this is how they affect our health outcomes. Let's fix this. So we would always ask that people give a call to us. It's an online form. It only takes 5 minutes to fill out. And they can find that on our website at hemophiliafed.org. But, I think when you're immediately facing that kind of issue, figure out through your insurance plan how you file an appeal or a grievance. Talk to the facility where the issue is happening and see how you can work with them to file an appeal or a grievance. But start there. I would say don't take things lying down. If you've made a good faith effort, figure out a way to make a little noise and try to get it resolved without being just shackled by this kind of cost.
I totally agree. I would also say check with, and this could be the national organization, it could be a patient advocate group. See if you're in a state that is one of those 28 states that has already passed surprise billing protections, and see if they apply to you. If you have the type of insurance that is governed by those, reach out to your lawmakers. That's another way to make noise, like Sonja was saying. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which, there's been a fair amount of public shaming of institutions that do this. And sometimes that, especially in the past year, and sometimes that has borne fruit. It's a crazy way to make policy to, whoever gets identified in a particular newspaper article all of a sudden decides to not be so aggressive in pursuing patients, but that's where we seem to be. And lawmakers need to know this just as patient advocates need to know this, because they're the ones who are in position to change the law.
That's great. And we're going to provide HFA's website and the direct link to Project Calls in our program notes. So listeners, you can check it out there. If you have issues, you guys can contact HFA directly. To kind of wind down, this is a bummer, topic and question to wind down with, but with all that's happening in politics, in the media about what's happening in DC, how much of all of that stuff, the media stuff, the impeachment stuff, what is it like for issues that matter to the American people with stuff like this? What happens to these bills when these larger things that eat up our media space are going on? What is it like down there?
It definitely makes things challenging. It is hard to get people's attention. They're caught up in other kinds of hearings or other kinds of meetings or talking, making themselves available to media. And I think it also makes it harder to get the two sides, the two parties, to agree to work on something. That surprise billing fixes are something that have bipartisan support, both parties support, but unfortunately the environment is so challenging for all the other things going on that it makes it hard to pass even legislation that both sides support, which is unfortunate.
I would say don't be discouraged, that people shouldn't be discouraged about that. I mean, there's a lot of noise in DC, but I always like to think that patients have louder voices, citizens have louder voices, and absolutely we need to be reaching back out to our lawmakers to say, this issue matters to me. This issue of surprise billing matters to me, and keep reminding them, yes, impeachment, other issues take up a lot of headspace, right? And make a lot of noise, but many voices can be very loud too. So we can't let this issue get lost. We as the patients, we as the community need to raise a stink and make sure that this issue isn't forgotten.
Spoken like a true advocate. I love it. I love it. I just want to thank both of you for joining me today. This stuff is so complicated, and you guys both just added to the understanding of it and what to do and kind of the nature of DC right now. So I really appreciate it, and I look forward to following your work at HFA with this. I look forward as we move into election season.
Thank you.
It's going to be a long haul. Thanks, Amy.
Absolutely. And hey, everybody, just as a reminder, if you receive a bill from an out-of-network provider for a planned procedure, please contact HFA to help navigate with project calls. We have tremendous resources for insurance issues in this community, so always remember that you are not alone. And that is it for episode 32 of the Ask the Expert podcast series. We will be back next month with another expert interview.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join the exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the ol' internet. I think you'll love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and, most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community, brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on the Living with Hemophilia Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. I mean, unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
BloodstreamMedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorder community.
Once on BloodstreamMedia.com, don't forget to follow the links to subscribe to the Bloodstream Podcast, Ask the Expert Podcast, the Powering Through Podcast, and the Bloodline Podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Have a question that you would like to hear an expert answer?
Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on facebook.com/bloodstreammedia and on Twitter @bloodstreaminfo.
This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Amy Board.
Produced by Patrick James Lynch, Rob Bradford,
Joshua Sterling Bragg,
Avra Friedman,
and Colby Crow. Artwork by Katie Wright Mead
and Ryan Geelan.
And the Ask the Expert podcast is edited by Allison Stoney.
I'm your host, Amy Board, and until next time, embrace that mystery and fear of life. You are not alone.